Hi, my name is Mark Slatter. I'm a professor of theological ethics with the Faculty of Theology here at St. Paul University, and I've been invited to share with you the heart of the matter. What I'd like to talk to you about today is the original meaning of the crucifixion. For me, this message about the meaning of Jesus' death has been a game changer, and I think it has incredible implications for people's lives and the life of believing communities. A number of years ago, I was a pastor at a parish, and I had arrived in late August, and in September, I was told that there was somebody who had belonged to the parish for many years who had just died, and I was going to be doing the funeral as a Catholic priest. And discreetly, I inquired in the community about who the deceased was, got some facts, met with the family, and one of the things that I heard was that he had been a biker or involved with a biking club. It didn't really register on my radar. I thought it was just something of a hobby this guy had pursued. So the day of the funeral arrived, and I was out in this country parish just outside of Ottawa. And it was one of these beautiful September afternoons. It was about 25 degrees and the sun was out, and of course it was just beautiful with the forest around this small country church. And as I was there with a few family members and parishioners, out in the distance I could hear this low rumbling of machines, and this rumbling became louder and louder and louder, and eventually around the corner I could see a bit of a procession. And the procession began with the funeral hearse and another limousine carrying the deceased, and then another funeral hearse, and behind that was a trailer holding up what I presume to be the deceased's motorcycle, and it was a Harley Davidson on top of this trailer being pulled behind the limo. And then there were a few cars, and then beyond that there was a flanks of motorcycles that must have been 50 long, side by side. And it was a sight to see, to say the least. So they poured into the front of the churchyard, and there was dust being thrown open. It was like a scene from a Western. I saw everything except tumbleweed go across the yard. And the funeral procession halted, and people got off their bikes, got out of the cars, and I kind of welcomed the family and the casket with the deceased. And I led the procession into the church, and then I turned around, and it seemed that at least 2/3 of those who were on these motorcycles had come into the church, and the rest were outside in the churchyard, and we could all hear them kind of celebrating and cracking open some brews, and I'm sure just having a good time. And the other bikers had decided to come into the church, and when I turned around to look at them, I realized that a lot of them were feeling quite intimidated. And there was an obvious contrast between this country church and how a lot of them were dressed. These were kind of tough folk, I gotta say. Some of them actually had patches from motorcycle gangs. Not a lot, but a few. Most of the motorcycle people wore orange and black, which are the colors of Harley Davidson, and I could see Harley Davidson leather jackets and bandanas and the whole bit. And I wanted to make a connection with these people to help them feel comfortable in this church. I'm sure many of them hadn't been in a church in maybe years, decades. So I had a little bit of a flash of insight. A couple of months previous, my father and I were out for lunch, and as we were chatting after dinner, I looked at his watch and I said, "Boy, I like your watch, Dad." And he looked at mine and he said, "I like your watch, Mark." And we traded watches. And the watch that I happened to get from Dad was this Harley Davidson watch. You can maybe see it at home with the orange and the black there. So what I did at this funeral is I thought maybe I can make a connection this way. So I said to the people in an informal way, "I don't know about you, but I see all of this kind of Harley Davidson bling going on, and I just want you to know that I've got the watch," and I went like this to them, "but I don't have the guts yet to buy the bike." After I said that, there was this kind of wave of laughter in the church, and I made a connection. The people, for whatever reason, they were connecting maybe with a cool priest or Harley Davidson in a church, whatever it was, the symbol of Harley Davidson made a connection for them. And I never forgot it. In fact, it's one of the most memorable funerals that I've presided at. And what really struck me afterwards, and I've thought about it ever since, and this occurred about 10 years ago, was that the Harley Davidson logo did for them what the crucifix should be doing, but no longer does. And this is the problem with symbols, is that the symbols, whatever they could be, from music, from a motorcycle club, or even from a faith tradition, can become domesticated and quite separate from the original context from which these symbols emerged. So 50 years ago, the Harley Davidson logo was a symbol for outliers, people who were kind of social nonconformists, people who didn't belong, people who were free spirits, people who were outside of the law. Nowadays, everybody sports some kind of Harley Davidson logo. You could furnish your whole house with Harley Davidson stuff. Middle-aged people, retirees who have a bit of cash, are now members of these motorcycle clubs, and they all sport Harley Davidson. But it doesn't have the same meaning that it had 50 years ago. It's gone mainstream. You could literally dress in Harley Davidson stuff and you wouldn't attract any kind of suspicion from the cops. The same thing is true with the cross, the crucifixion of Jesus. And what has happened over the centuries is that we've domesticated something and made it very easy to look at, easy to swallow. In fact, what the cross has become is a symbol for insiders. It says to people, we belong, and it also says to a whole other group of people, we don't belong. And these are the symbols that we see on top of the churches, and people feel that this is the place where if you have your moral act together, you belong. If you don't have your moral act together, please don't approach. And in a sense, it's the problem that Christianity has always had with the crucifix. Because it is such an unpalpable symbol, we tend to lose its original meaning. I don't know if you recall ever seeing some of the old school tools that were used by the vampire hunters in some of the classic black and white horror films, where they would just hold up the crucifix or the cross at the vampire, and the vampire would look at it, it would hiss and it would flee. Well, ironically, there's something in that reaction to the cross which is more akin to the early experience of the church when they saw a cross or a crucifixion. In fact, for the early Christians, the cross was not the symbol of Christianity. For the first 325 years of the Christian community, the primary symbol of Christianity was the fish, or the anchor, and in some places the beehive, the shepherd. I've had the privilege of being in Rome a couple of times, have visited 4 of the 5 catacombs that are open to the public. And in each of these tours that I've taken to look at the kind of arrangements that the early Christians had for ritualizing death, some of them were quite wealthy, could afford to make little chapels with cupolas, sarcophagi, with etchings inside of them and on top of them. And I've always tried to make a point of looking for the symbol of the cross or crucifixion. And in all of those 4 catacombs, you cannot find the sign of the cross or the symbol of the cross. And after each of these, I've asked the tour guide, who for all intents and purposes is a scholar of antiquity, and I've asked them, kind of knowing what the answer is, where's the cross? And each time they've told me that for the early Christians, the crucifixion was still such a scandalous event, and the meanings associated with crucifixion were still so scandalous that they could not associate themselves with it as a sign of their faith. It wasn't until the year 325 with Constantine when Christianity was made an official state religion and crucifixion was abolished as a form of execution by the state, that the crucifixion and the cross as we see it finally became the symbol for Christianity. The original meaning of crucifixion, it beggars description, because nowadays it's difficult for us to be offended by things that we would consider to be blasphemy or sacrilege. But for the early Christians and the Romans and the whole religious ethos of antiquity, crucifixion was incredibly offensive stuff. People didn't talk about it in polite conversation. It was an anti-religious symbol. It affected religious sensibilities. It was a kind of oxymoron. You couldn't mix the fact that this alleged Son of God died on a cross. To mix the two itself was the very definition of blasphemy and sacrilege. The closest example I can think of that comes to this sense of offense is the reaction to the postmodern artwork, The Piss Christ, that came out, I think, in around 1984, 1985. And what the artist did is he urinated in a vat that was a clear vat. It was made of acrylic, and he suspended the cross in his urine, sealed it, and this was apparently some kind of art expression. At the time, I was offended because of the blending of these two elements. What I don't think the author was aware of is that unwittingly, when he blended urine with a religious symbol, he came closest to the original aversion of the Christians and of all of society against the suggestion that the Son of God died on a cross. This was such a burden for the early Christians in their missionary activity throughout the Mediterranean that St. Paul had to constantly remind them, no, it's the message of the cross and resurrection we go back to. They wanted to flee from it. They wanted to have nothing to do with it. And when people looked at the cross, it basically meant that the one who was being crucified was being condemned by God. In other words, the disciples fled from the cross not because they were trying to escape some kind of punishment by association, but when they saw this, they recalled what it said in Deuteronomy, "Cursed is the one who hangs on a tree." Now, the original cross probably looked nothing like this. It probably looked more like this, the Tau crosses we're familiar with. But they ran from it because this was, for the Jews, the sign of what we would call excommunication, or what some Protestants might call proof in the pudding that this person has been damned. In other words, Jesus' death on the cross was God's concrete meting out of judgment on earth that this person, in fact, was condemned, died, basically excommunicated and damned. So I'm just barely touching the surface of what the offensive properties of crucifixion was for the Romans and for the Jews and for all of antiquity. Lenny Bruce, that great comedian of the 1960s, said that if Jesus had been crucified 20 years ago, Catholic school children would be wearing little electric chairs around their necks instead of crosses. So in other words, instead of wearing this, which is very easy, you can wear a crucifix or a cross anywhere and not get any second glances. Really what we might need to start wearing, and I'm saying this tongue-in-cheek, is this. Or a rifle in countries where they still execute people by firing squad. Or perhaps a syringe where they administer lethal injection. Or a noose where they hang the worst of the worst. In other words, this probably comes closer to the original meaning of a crucifixion than this does. So, the scandal of the cross that Paul talks about, we're familiar with it. We've heard about it. He says it so many times in so many of his letters, has basically lost the scandal because we've lost touch with the original meaning of crucifixion. Jesus was not crucified between two candles on an altar. He was crucified outside of Jerusalem between two thieves, and basically he died a crook. Christ the Crook probably was the title that this screamed out, and not the Son of God. I think this has huge implications for the church, for Christian life. First of all, sadly, for most people today, going to church has become synonymous with being virtuous. When many of us walk into our churches Sunday morning and we're aware maybe of a sin in our life, or that morally we're not where we think we ought to be, oftentimes when people look at this, the first thing they feel when they look at this in a church is shame that they don't belong. In fact, many of us, when we're driving to church or walking to church, what we try to do before we actually get to the church is fix ourselves up morally or spiritually so that we feel we can be presentable once we actually arrive. What this says and what it means originally is that the place, the only place where you can be yourself and where you can bring in all of your stuff, regardless, is supposed to be in a church. But if this becomes a domesticated symbol of religiosity, no wonder we try to keep our sin not only out of God's sight, but even out of our own sight. I think this also has huge implications for our relationship to the world. And I'll just end on this. When I was at this same parish years ago, I had also developed a bit of a support, friendship, acquaintanceship with a Catholic deacon who was also with the military and doing service in Kandahar, Afghanistan. And every other Sunday morning, as I was in this beautiful country setting going out to celebrate Eucharist, oftentimes in the morning I would receive from this fellow an email that was kind of sharing where he was in his life and how his own spiritual dynamic was working in this war zone. And it was quite surreal, the contrast of what he dealt with and what I was dealing with. And in one of my emails to him, I said, Bob, you know, you're a man of faith. There you are in Kandahar. So where is God for you in Kandahar? And he responded with a very insightful reflection. And I have his permission in perpetuity to be able to share this email with people. He says, God is outside the wire. The expression outside the wire has a different meaning depending upon where you are. The wire refers to the defensive position around an encampment. The wire is also the first warning system in case of danger approaching the camp. Those who are inside the wire are generally secure and live a normal routine, almost the same as back home, but with crappy accommodations. I suppose that would be where the Tim Hortons would be. Those who live outside of the wire are in the danger zone, as it were. There's little protection, and you're exposed to the threat of death or harm. The reason I said that God is outside the wire is because it is out here that I've been forced out of my little routines and my comforts. As a result, everything has been stripped away from me, totally naked, with no defenses to protect me. It was that very experience of being so vulnerable that I felt God rushing in, and that I could see Him more clearly than I ever did before. The more that I'm out here, the more I'm losing my ego. So, in a sense, the faith of the cross, the faith of a crucifixion, is very different from the faith of cultural Christianity. Jesus was crucified outside of the religious precincts. And in my experience, oftentimes where we think God is, God often is not. And where a lot of us think God is not at all, God is there in spades. This is what the crucifixion means. It means to give us permission with our own brokenness, our own kind of precincts that are outside of religiosity, our own places that need to be redeemed, and especially to give us the freedom to be able to be ourselves wherever we go. It's a game changer. I humbly submit, and there's much more to this, but I hope I've whet your appetite. Thank you very much.